Gentlemen, we're going to be in Genesis 15, 16, and 17. We won't really get to 18 because there's really too much material to cover here. Our primary focus is going to be God's promise and Abram's acceptance of that promise. Kind of as a way of overview, Genesis 15 is where God makes that covenant, that blood path covenant or betrothal covenant with Abram. Abram asks for proof of God's promise, and God makes a covenant ritual with him. We'll also briefly look at Genesis 16, Hagar and Ishmael, kind of how Abraham and Sarai try to answer their own prayer request, which we can be guilty of. Chapter 17 is the covenant of circumcision. We'll look at that here in a little bit, how God changes Abram and Sarai's name. We'll also look at, well, again, if you get to chapter 18, you're not taking enough prayer requests or visiting enough. That's a little joke. I didn't say it was funny. I just said it was a joke. I don't know how you could possibly get to 18, but our main focus today is God's promise to Abram. Just kind of by way of icebreaker, I'd like to ask the question, what's the biggest covenant or promise that you've ever entered? Probably some will say my relationship with God or my marriage. Maybe they'll say their house mortgage or a car. Maybe there's another covenant that they've made. I think it might be kind of interesting to hear those things, but again, just by way of icebreaker. Our primary questions are going to be, what do we learn about God? What are the implications for us today? What can we learn about the covenant God, Yahweh? Before we dig into the chapter 15, let me pray for us. Blessed be your name, Father. You are always faithful, always righteous, always good and true, and we just acknowledge that. Let our words build up and bless. I pray that you will speak truth through your word, affirm that truth in our hearts, help us to see the kind of God that you are, a God that's faithful, a God that keeps his promises. Let us honor you through this study of Genesis. We pray this through the name of our precious Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. Amen. Genesis chapter 15. I think it's very interesting that God begins chapter 15 by saying, fear not. That's like the first thing he says to Abram. And obviously when an angel says fear not, or God will say fear not, why would that be there? But people are scared. Abram is wondering, how's God going to make all this happen? And we'll note there in verse 2, it says, but Abram said, O Lord God, etc., etc. Verse 3, Abram will say, and Abram said. So there's Abram has wait just a minute, God. And then he has another, and it doesn't seem like God responds between either. It's interesting how God just lets him believe or think whatever he wants to believe or think. Abraham is struggling to see how God will fulfill his promise. And it's interesting because God will, here in a little bit, we'll see how God reveals a little bit of how he's going to do it. And then Abram and Sarah in their own doing say, hey, we can make this happen. Here's how we're going to do it in chapter 16. And they come up with their own plan that has its own disastrous consequences. So obviously the rhetorical question is, are there any lessons in there for us? Are there any things that we need to consider? I might be trying to answer my own prayer request. I might be trying to manipulate things behind the scene to make things happen rather than just letting God work. Now, that's obviously, we're not calling for laziness. We're not saying there's absolutely no part that we play, but we want to make it clear we need to learn to trust God and seek God, be obedient to him, seek the Spirit for guidance and wisdom in things. Sometimes it is better simply to just trust God. I don't know how this is going to work out with me having cancer. I don't know how this is going to work out with my spouse wanting to leave me. I have no idea how in the world that my drug addict kid, my child that's going through a divorce, I have no idea how all this is going to work out. But I'm going to be faithful to pray, and I'm going to be faithful to trust that God will work. I'm not going to try to manipulate things on my own. So again, the biggest key with all this is we don't see God's perspective. We don't understand his plan. We need to trust God even when it feels like he is silent, when we don't feel like we're hearing from him. But then God will respond. He'll tell Abram, Eliezer's not going to be your heir. The stars will be equivalent to your offspring. And so God's making a big promise here. God's saying, man, if you can count all those stars, that's how many children, that's how many descendants, rather, you will have. And what I love about verse 6 is Abram believed. So we have to ask the question, what kind of man was Abram? What kind of God is Yahweh? And you'll note that YHWH, the Tetragrammaton, or Yahweh, YAHWEH is how we often spell it. But God's name that we'll find in Exodus 3, and we'll talk about that in the fall quarter. But I continue to go back to this for, again, there's a method to my madness. So if you look at verse 7 through verse 12, Abram's struggling with this land promise. The descendant promise, it says he believed. And I think it's kind of logical to say, well, Abram believed that because in his lifetime, he would see that son. But he also understood, in my lifetime, I'm not going to own all this land. So how can I know? How can I know for a fact that I will possess this land? So it says, God put Abram into a deep sleep. He does this. It's kind of interesting. Verse 8, God tells Abram, bring me a heifer, bring me a goat, bring me a ram, bring me some birds. Now, most of us would go get those animals and bring them, and there they'd be, and maybe the cows would be running around, the goats would be running around. But you'll notice, he just says, bring them to me. What does Abram do? It says in verse 10, Abram brought them, and then he cuts them in half, and he lays out that. Abram knew exactly what was going on here. Abram understood that God was making a covenant with him. This is often referred to as a betrothal. In other words, husband-wife, marital kind of covenant. A son-in-law would do this with the father-in-law. The son-in-law would say, the father-in-law would make the promise, she is a virgin bride. And the son-in-law would make the promise, I will provide for her. I will do everything to be faithful to this woman. I will take care of her. And the idea was if either one of them would break that covenant, whatever happened to those animals would happen to them. That's essentially what they're saying. And they would put on these white robes and they would put these animals kind of towards each other, and there would be this blood path that they would walk down. And as they would splash through this, it would splash up on their robes and so forth. Again, some refer to this covenant as a blood path covenant or a betrothal covenant. We'll see this in Jeremiah 34. But the idea here is the promise that these two people are making in this covenant. If I break this covenant, do this to me. Split me in half. May I die if I don't keep my half. And I think that's exactly why in verse 12 it says Abram fell into a deep sleep. By the way, it's kind of a little bit comical there in verse 11 because it says birds of prey begin to descend on the carcasses. Why would the birds of prey begin to descend on the carcass? Well, Abram kind of backed himself into a corner. God, let's make a covenant. Why don't you prove to me that you're going to do what you said you would do? And then I think Abram realized, wait, this is the God of the universe. This is a creator. This is the one whose word is true. He speaks. Everything he speaks becomes. And so his word is always true. And I think Abram realized, man, I backed myself into a corner. So he's kind of him-hawing around. He's delaying this covenant. And that's why he's having to shoot these birds. The birds of prey didn't instantly come upon these carcasses. Abram was sitting there waiting until God eventually put Abram into a deep sleep. And it's interesting because this language is very similar. I believe it's the same Hebrew term that it uses back in Genesis 3, Genesis 2, where it talks about God putting Adam to sleep into this deep sleep, and when he took the rib to make Eve. So verse 8, Abram said, Abram believed God would give offspring, maybe doubted the land promise. So again, what's the lesson here for us? And then in verse 9, Yahweh responds, what does God ask of Abram? These are some questions that you can ask your audience. In verse 10, Abram responds, but we ask the question, what did God ask and why did God ask Abram to do these things. Again, trying to understand this whole covenant idea. So then in verse 13 through 20, we see God kind of comes to Abram and tells him all that's going to happen through apparently maybe a vision while he's in this deep sleep, or potentially a time later. He tells him about everything that will happen. We see this in Exodus. It would seem like this happened during the deep sleep. This was kind of a vision thing. But Yahweh, by the way, we assume that these things here in chapter 15 happen back to back, but there is a time lapse that I've noted in your notes, and you can look at that later. Smoke and fire, it says there that, that two things passed through these, as Abram slept, two things passed through this blood path covenant, if you will, between the animals. Some things passed, and one thing was essentially it was smoke and fire, right? We see this idea of the smoke and fire. The pillar by day would be it's a smoking fire pot and a flaming torch that passes through. But the idea of smoke and fire is, you'll remember in Exodus, this was foreshadowing Exodus, the pillar of fire by night, the pillar of cloud by day. There's many representations when God's glory fills the temple, fills the tabernacle, the smoke that fills, many references throughout the Bible of God's consuming fire, etc. And so this is clearly of God, speaks of God, but I want you to note that two things passed through. In a typical covenant, there would be two that would pass through. Abram did not pass through, so God passed through for Abram in this covenant. And this idea of God, of two things passing through, I believe is essentially what I've read and understood, is essentially that God's saying, I'll keep my end of the covenant, and I'll even keep your end of the covenant. But when Abram would break his end of the covenant, there would ultimately be, as promised in Genesis 3:15, throughout the Old Testament, into the New Testament, and ultimately through Jesus Christ and the cross, God is saying, I will fulfill your part even when you break the covenant. I'll be the one that gets split in two or hung on a cross, cursed on a tree. So God was willing to make this covenant and keep this covenant. Then we come to chapter 16. You'll note Abram and Sarai try to take things into their own hands. And Abram, for whatever reason, be it just lust, and he's like, yeah, I'll take Hagar, or be it, I just want you to shut up, woman, to Sarai rather, or maybe he helped concoct this. It seems like it's her plan, because in verse 2 it says she said to him, but she says, take my maidservant, the maidservant Hagar, the slave from Egypt. Again, a situation that they kind of got themselves into by lying about the brother-sister thing, or at least half-truths there. They get themselves into this trouble, and then now they have this slave who's pregnant, and Sarai goes to throw her out. Abram and Sarai fight. There's some jealousy there. Goes to throw her out. And then I love in verse 8, it's very reminiscent of 1 Kings 19, when Elijah is depressed. He says, basically he tells God, just kill me. I want to die. I don't want to live on. It's kind of like he's suicidal. And there's a lot of jokes about, give somebody a nap and a snack and they're fine, because he sleeps, and then there's fresh baked bread there on the rock. The angel has fresh baked bread. And Elijah gets up and goes and finds Elisha, and crowns a king and so forth. But here we see God asking Hagar kind of to sober her up. Where have you come from, and where are you going? And she says, I've been mistreated, and here's all the problems, and here's everything that's going on. And it says that the Lord said, you're pregnant with a son. You shall call him Ishmael, because the Lord has listened to your affliction. Verse 12 is hilarious to me. He shall be a wild donkey of a man. I'll leave that one alone, but it's comical. But then it says in verse 13, God appears to this slave girl, the forgotten one, the thrown out one. And again, you see this idea of God cares about everybody. This is kind of reminiscent of sorry, I just went blank. Luke 15. Luke 15. Kind of the leaving the 99 for one. Everybody's significant in God's kingdom. I think that's really important to note here. But she calls him El Roi. The idea, you are the God that sees me. And I believe I have a definition there of the God who watches over me. Similar to God being the God of David, but he's also the God of this desperate, seemingly insignificant slave girl and her son. He is the God who watches over me. It's such a beautiful, we'll see this in Psalms 23, many other Psalms. This name, El Roi. So then, chapter 16, verse 14, through long about chapter 17, verse 8, we see the name change. Now, this is some of my favorite. Verse 5, you'll no longer be Abram, you'll become Abraham. It's so cool. This part to me is so mind-blowing because God takes the name of Abram, and we see this in a husband and wife. For instance, Barbara Palafox, in her probably not most fine moment, agreed to marry me 28 years ago. And she took on the last name Gary. That's my last name, my dad's last name, and dropped the name Palafox. Actually, she ended up putting that as her middle name because she never had a middle name. That's another story for another time. But in a similar way, when we make these covenants, like a marital covenant, there'll be a name change, right? Well, that's what God's doing here. Because God's name, Yahweh, again, the Tetragrammaton, YHWH. We went back with the word Adonai and filled those in. Hopefully you can see that on the screen there well enough. But he took the H from his name and placed it in the middle here of Abram's name, making Abram become Abraham. So we see God changing Abram's name to Abraham, and when he makes a covenant. Now this is what's so mind-blowing to me, because it's one thing to be like, yeah, I'll give you my name, but here's what God, Yahweh, the eternal God, does. He takes on this covenant name himself, and multiple times, I've listed some of those verses there, but multiple times he will from this point on be known as the God, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So he makes a covenant with Abram. He makes a covenant with the son, Isaac. He makes a covenant with the grandson, Jacob. And of course, Jacob's name is later changed to Israel. And God continues to be, is often referred to as well as the God of Israel. That covenant will remain multiple times. But to me, this is one of the coolest things in this section here, this Genesis, specifically Genesis chapter 17. God is making these I will promises, and you'll note those in your notes. You can ask your class, you know, what are the statements that God says he'll do? Exceedingly fruitful, great nation, kings, etc. And then he also, the latter half, asks Abram and gives Abram a part to keep his covenant, to be circumcised, etc. But this, to me, is so awesome. In a similar way, you and I, we become a new creation. We have a new name in Jesus. We become different in Christ. And so there's so much power in this changing of the name. But I also want to note something really important here, because God says in chapter 17, I'll establish my covenant with you, but I want you to be circumcised. And he says, anybody who's not circumcised in your household, I don't care if he was born to you or whatever else happens there, I don't really care. If they're not circumcised, they are not a part of the covenant, which is a huge statement. Because you think, well, they could easily say, hey, he established this covenant with Abram, and so I'm Abram's son, Isaac, I'm in, right? God makes it very clear. Verse 14, any uncircumcised male who is not circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin shall be cut off from my people. He has broken my covenant. Now what's crazy is that Paul will then, in Colossians 2, make baptism and circumcision, he'll link those two. Now he says it's not a cutting off of the flesh. That's also not what's going off like the physical covenant of the Old Testament, the Abraham covenant. It's not like that. God's cutting off our sin in this covenant. But similarly, if you're not circumcised in the Old Testament, you're not a part of the covenant. And then in the New Testament, we see if you're not baptized, you can't be a part of the covenant. That's when we receive forgiveness, Holy Spirit, see Acts 2:38 and all that good stuff. You all know that stuff. But I also want to note really quickly as we wrap up at the end of chapter 17, this, in my opinion, this is no small ask. I mean, this is a little bit of pain, and I don't want to be disrespectful. I know we're all guys here, so I don't really have to worry about the ladies. I'm not going to bring this up in class, but this is kind of a big ask of a 99-year-old man. 99 years old when he's circumcised, and it says in verse 23 and verse 26, that very day. So again, we know Abram is obedient. He's quick to obey. So what does that lesson say for us? Okay, there's chapter 18. You can look into that. I have a few more notes. There's plenty in here to look at between reading and comments and so forth. Hopefully this blesses you and encourages you. You're reminded of how good God is, how He is one that comes down and participates and becomes a part. And He could have very easily said, well, I'll give you some of my name, but far be it from me to take your name. God not only gives some of His name to Abram in making that covenant, He also takes some of Abram for Himself and changes essentially his identity. God is the same. He never changes. I understand that. But the way He is identified, the way people will call on His name, He becomes the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob from that time on. Whew, man, that is so huge in my mind. Hopefully, again, this challenges you. This encourages you. Please make it your own. Please make it practical. That's really crucial from my perspective. I don't want this to just be a history lesson. I want us to ask, what am I supposed to do about this? How can I follow in the steps of Abraham? What do I need to be more quickly to be obedient in? What kind of things am I trying to answer my own prayer request and causing myself fits? Where do I need to just be still, trust God, know that He'll take care of it? Where do I need to act? But also, where do I need to kind of lay back and not try to manipulate or control circumstances, but just trust in God, trust in His provision. Serve such an awesome God. I pray that that comes out of this. We see His grace, we see His mercy and love, that we can also, again, see how He chooses to partner with people like Abram that are not perfect, but also are very generous, because chapter 18 we'll see their hospitality level is off the charts. If you get time to get into that, you'll note that Abraham tells Sarah at this point, Abraham tells Sarah, go get 3 seahs of fine flour. Look at the footnotes, how much flour that is, and think about how much bread that will make, how much is required to make bread, etc. It's fairly mind-blowing. Powerful lesson here about how God makes a promise. God keeps His promise, but even in that promise and even in His grace and faithfulness and mercy, there is a part we play. We have to accept that gift. And so hopefully that will come to light as you share that with the men and women in your class. Let me pray for us and we'll be done. God, thank You for being a faithful covenant God. Praise Your name. I thank You in the name of Jesus. Amen.